Okay, if you guys are all ready, I will start us off. So welcome to everybody. My name is Susan Versen. I'm a head of reference here at Massanutten Regional Library, and I want to welcome you to our first diary session of the season. And I'm going to do a brief introduction and then we will get started. So this will give hopefully people time to join us. So I want to welcome everybody to Massanutten Regional Library's annual Diary Program series on local history. Programs on local history and culture presented by local authorities in their fields. This year focuses on African American experiences in the Shenandoah Valley. The Dyerly Program series on local history honors Dr. Henry Price Dyerly, a local physician, and his wife Mary, who was a nurse. As early collectors of antiques and artifacts produced in the Shenandoah Valley, the Dyerlys were instrumental in raising awareness of and research into the valley's rich cultural history. In honor of their parents, the Dyerly children have supported Massanutten Regional Library for over 20 years, and it is because of them that this lecture series is made possible. Tonight, our program will present a roundtable discussion exploring the history of African American education in Harrisonburg and Rockingham County, and I will introduce our panel in just a minute. I want to remind you that there are two more upcoming programs in this series. Next Thursday, March 11th, again at 7 p.m. on Zoom, we will host Daryl J. Howard, who will discuss his book, Sunday Coming, Black Baseball in Virginia, which traces the history of Black baseball across the Commonwealth through the words of the men who played the game. That is available at MRL. And then the following Thursday, March 18th, again at 7 p.m., we will talk to local playwright, poet, and historian Bree Madden Olavares. She will discuss her experience researching local African American history and how that research contributed to her creative works, including Not Made for This, a play based on the narrative of Jordan Banks, who was enslaved on the Charles Yancey plantation in Elkton, Virginia. Again, all of these programs will be presented live via Zoom, and you can pre-register by visiting mrlib.org. All sessions, including this one, will be recorded and available on the MRL YouTube channel as well. And just a brief reminder that all branches of MRL are now open for browsing, and that the central branch in Harrisonburg is currently hosting the traveling exhibit of the Celebrating Sims exhibit. A few Zoom housekeeping tips. As you've probably realized, this is a webinar format, so all attendees are muted. If you have questions, please use the Q&A box, which is down at the bottom of your screen, and you can type your questions in there, and then we will send them to the panelists. We have some prepared questions ahead of time, which we will start the program with. And now let me introduce tonight's panel. Beau Dickinson is our moderator, and he currently serves as the K-12 Social Studies Supervisor for Rockingham County Public Schools. This past year, he had the honor of serving on the Governor's Commission on African American History Education that made significant recommendations and technical edits designed to enrich state standards related to Black history. In addition to his work at the state level, he is particularly interested in how national events unfolded at the local level within the Harrisonburg-Rockingham community. He serves as the chair of the Board of Trustees for Rocktown History, and he has worked to bring local history resources to the students of Rockingham County Public Schools. Dale McAllister is past president of the Harrisonburg-Rockingham Historical Society. He is currently the resident historian for the society. He has also been the newsletter writer and editor for the Shenandoah Valley Folklife Society for nearly 3 decades. In these roles, he has been involved in many projects to research and help preserve the religious, cultural, and historical heritage of Harrisonburg, Rockingham County, and the Shenandoah Valley. He is also the author of the book Lucy Frances Sims, From Slavery to Revered Public Service, which is also available at the library. Ms. Karen Thomas is the founder and president of the Northeast Neighborhood Association of Harrisonburg, Virginia, NENA. It is the mission of the association to make the neighborhood a secure, attractive, and strong community. It engages in partnerships with community residents and families, government officials and departments, and non-governmental agencies and institutions to revitalize the neighborhood and to address the needs of the residents of the community. Under the leadership of Ms. Thomas, the Northeast Neighborhood Association has held public meetings at the Lucy F. Sims Center on the 3rd Thursday of every month. NENA leads African American historical preservation and cultural heritage projects in Harrisonburg, Virginia. Ms. Thomas also wrote the foreword to the biography of Lucy Frances Sims. And now I'm going to turn the program over to our panelists. So you can take it away, Beau.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much for that introduction. It is indeed an honor to be here and to be a part of this. as a social studies teacher and supervisor, I just feel so strongly about what we're doing here this evening and what we're engaging in conversation about. It's an honor to be with Dale. Dale's one of my former teacher and one of my former teachers. So it was an honor to work with him in this regard on this very important project. This first ever biography about this local heroine in our community that has such a powerful story to tell. A very long overdue biography that started as a few PowerPoint slides and a short essay, is my understanding, that Dale had done many years ago, and evolved into this 200 plus page biography that tells her life story. So he spent many years working on this project, and it's so wonderful to have it now, and to also have reflections from Karen and her perspective. Karen lives in Miss Sims' historic community of Newtown on the northeast side of Harrisonburg. And as Susan mentioned, she contributed a very powerful foreword to the book. And it's, for me, as a teacher, it's something that it's great to have in our community. As many of you know, the namesake of our Teacher of the Year, our Educator of the Year award for both the city and the county schools is the Lucy F. Sims award that's given annually. That was something that started probably about the year 2000. So we're about our 20th anniversary of having that namesake and that honor attached to it. And it's just wonderful now to have this resource and this book in the hands of students, to be able to learn about Miss Sims, but also to be able to learn about her story into the lens of local people and local stories, as well as into the African-American experience, because her life, of course, began as an enslaved person here in this community, just prior to the Civil War. She was freed through emancipation. She went to school and became educated during Reconstruction, and then dedicated her life to the students of this community. First, out in the far reaches of there, you see the, well, before it's been renovated, the chapel there in Zenda, which is out towards Lacey Spring. Her first year there, and then moving into the city to teach another 56 years, quite famously missing only one half day. So what a powerful story. And now, because of the underwriter of this project, we can say that every Virginia U.S. history class, which is taught in the 11th grade, has a class set of this book. That's 30 copies, enough for each student that would be in the classroom at a given time. And that is in probably, I think, 11 classrooms, 11 different teachers of that class in the 4 county high schools, and in our city high school, which will be 2 high schools here shortly. So that's a wonderful starting point for us tonight. My first question this evening goes to Karen. Karen, your connection to this story is quite personal, since you have roots in Miss Sims' historic community of Newtown. And given that you live just a few houses down from the actual Sims home that still stands. We should also mention that as NENA president, you have worked to acquire the historic Dallard Newman house, which still stands on Kelly Street, and transform it into a museum about the Newtown community. What is your vision for telling this story? And what do you want Harrisonburg and Rockingham County residents to know and appreciate about the history of Newtown and the community that you call home?
Well, thank you all for having me here tonight. I appreciate that. I think we, the Northeast Neighborhood Association, envision a shared legacy for the future generations. And we anticipate residents from all over will come and appreciate the rich history that the Dallard Newman House has, which it was constructed in 1895 by emancipated men and women of Newtown, including the Dallard family. So this home is a fascinating testament to the rich urban life of the Newtown community following the Civil War. And it is one of the city's oldest monuments of African-American heritage and culture. that we hope that residents of Harrisonburg, Rockingham County, and all over will come and visit there.
Now, when we were discussing the forward, and I know that you were engaged in writing that, you had mentioned to me as you read Dale's book that you were curious about Miss Sims actually being in that house, correct?
Oh, correct. We're sure she was in that house many times, as her and George Newman, the principal of Lucy Sims School and Africa Street School, were very good friends. And so we're sure, you know, that she was in that house many times. She walked by there going to school. So it's just a comforting thing when you walk in and you think that we still have the original desk of Mr. George Newman. And you can imagine them sitting there talking, discussing their students and their lessons. So yeah, it's really powerful.
That place is so powerful with history. It makes history feel like it comes alive when you're at places where you can stand where they stood and their presence is still felt, I think.
Exactly.
Wow, great. Well, for Mr. McAllister, for Dale, as a county resident, what did you learn about Newtown as you were writing the Sims biography?
One of the things I noticed rather quickly was how important their schools were as community centers. And it was a place that they had pride in. There were a lot of community activities that went on in the schoolhouses. And when it was especially important because white society did not allow them to participate in a lot of things that the white students could do. So it was especially important to the Newtown community to have these schools which they treasured.
I especially like that component of the book, that we are teaching students about some hard history, right? That we're teaching students about the truth of perhaps some unfortunate parts of our past. But there's a way, of course, that we as social studies teachers do that so that we recognize that there were original sins associated with slavery, and of course the legacy of Jim Crow, and we have to be quite honest about that. But at the same time, recognizing that even though these schools were segregated as a result of Jim Crow laws, that they were still incredible places of learning, and that they were centers of community, and they were beloved. So, in teaching about African-American history, being quite honest about our past, but at the same time, finding the joy that is in Black culture and in Black history. I find that was very refreshing about the book and looking at Miss Sims' life and celebrating those components, while at the same time recognizing this true chapter of our history, which perhaps Americans have not always been as honest about in looking at fully. So that was one part of the book that struck me. To transition from that, there's a question for Karen about education, specifically in the community. What role did that play, education, within the culture and that sense of community that defined Newtown? Who were some of the teachers that perhaps stand out to you and to other community members as leaders?
Well, Beau, education was always a top priority for African Americans who resided in Newtown. It is important to remember that many of these people had either been formerly enslaved or their parents or grandparents were. So education was very important within the community, as it is today here. African American families knew they had to work harder to get the education they needed to succeed and survive. So there was never no not going to school. You would have to be almost hospitalized before your parents would allow you to stay home. So education was very important. Besides Miss Lucy Sims, our beloved educator and mother figure, there was Mr. George Newman, who served as a principal of the colored schools. Mr. Newman was also a pivotal leader in education, not only in the school, but in the community as well. He helped people register vote. He united the community by writing and producing plays. He set up lawn parties. He became a notary and often helped neighbors with legal matters. So an example of how important education was, of his 14 children, 6 of them became teachers in Rockingham County. So that just shows how important education was for the people in Newtown community. I know some of the teachers like W.N.P. Harris, he was also a principal and father figure for the young men and made sure that they were always on their good behavior. I hear that he would walk the halls many times a day. There was Mr. Giles, he was a principal at Sims, and he let his students know that I can't was not part of their vocabulary. There were so many. Mr. Eubanks, he was a shop instructor. You know, these people not only learned academics, they learned life skills. They made bedrooms and furniture, all types of carpentry and things. There was Miss Edith Tolliver. She was an English and French teacher. And of course, Miss Mary Awkward Fairfax, Miss Bunning Arrington. These students were not only taught, you know, like I said, the academic lessons, but the teachers were so dedicated and loved their students so much that the list goes on and on. There was many teachers besides Miss Lucy Sims. But she is our beloved icon.
Indeed. All of those folks I see within that Sims legacy that she began.
Right.
And continued on in those subsequent generations. In the book, I learned so much about her brother, and I know that that became a significant portion of the book, Mr. Ulysses Grant Wilson. And he has his own chapter in the book and is featured in several others. His story I found very compelling as an educational leader, and just also the Black educators and how highly qualified they were. You know, his degrees and his work in history. Miss Fairfax had a master's degree from Columbia University. These were incredible stories that unfortunately for many years were isolated to these communities. And I feel like, you know, now we're starting to really, you know, look more broadly at our history and embrace these chapters, of course, as we should. I grew up in this community. I did not know the name Lucy Sims until I became an educator. So I hope that this continues to expand and we, you know, celebrate these chapters and these stories. Dale, my question for you to transition is what were those various chapters of education that evolved within Newtown from the earliest days of Reconstruction, when education would have become a formal practice rather than something that was learned through the home or wherever you could get it. Those early schools, and then leading up through the Sims years at the Effinger Street School, which unfortunately, tragically, no longer stands. Tell us a little bit about that history, if you would.
I'm going to start actually before the Civil War and remind people that most people thought that teaching slaves was against the law, teaching them to read and write. But the law itself only made it illegal in an assembly or a public gathering. So it was legal for a slave owner to teach his slaves at home, and educated slaves were worth more to the slave master than those who weren't, especially if they were the cook in the family like Lucy Sims' grandmother was for the Gray family. But the main reason probably that these families rationalized teaching them was so they could read the Bible on their own, which is thought to be a prime reason. Well, then let's think about after the war. A group started, a Freedmen's Bureau was started in the latter months of the Civil War to help the newly freed slaves who were in the eastern part of the state where the Union Army was in control. And their goal was to support schools for the newly freed slaves, and also to aid them with food needs and so forth. And so they were the ones who, the Freedmen's Bureau, that were in charge of educating Blacks in Harrisonburg from 1865 to 1870. In 1866, the year after the war, there was a sort of a census to find out how many potential students were African American that they could expect in school, and it was between 150 and 200 potential students. And so that year, the year before that, 1865, near the end of the year, they opened up a school in the town and rented quarters. And it had a teacher who was sponsored by the American Missionary Society. It turned out a lot of the teachers early on were from church societies in the North. In late in 1866, this is the year that there were 150 to 200 students, there were 3 schools opened with Northern teachers. They were coming from New England, and they had been sponsored by the Free Will Baptist Church. One of the classrooms was in a hotel that was basically across the street from the federal courthouse in Harrisonburg. And another was in the basement of the Northern Methodist Church, which was on West Market Street, where the Rosetta Stone building is. I guess it's still Rosetta Stone, but the big building there close to the railroad track. That had been the Northern Methodist Church during the Civil War. And so that was sort of a logical place for them to meet. And those 3 teachers in 1866 had 82 students they were teaching in the daytime and 100 at night. And certainly some of those night students were families, working people who wanted an education to complement their lives. The students at that time ranged from 4-year-olds to heads of family. And then by late 1868, the Freedmen's Bureau helped build a school especially for the African-American students. It was named the Whipple School, and it was on Black's Run along Rock Street, close to the Chop House in downtown Harrisonburg. The lot for that schoolhouse had come from the Gray family that owned Lucy Sims' family as slaves. And then residents called that sort of a nickname for the Whipple School because it's kind of an unusual name for around here. They called it the Little Old Schoolhouse by the Creek, as well as some other names. But the Whipple name was from a man who was a Northern abolitionist. And in fact, when Lucy Sims was attending Hampton Institute, Whipple, I think it was George Whipple, was a member of the board of trustees at Hampton Institute. And that schoolhouse had been built on pillars because it was located beside Black's Run, and Black's Run sometimes flooded. Well, the Freedmen's Bureau basically accomplished what they wanted to as far as getting the education started. And they closed in Virginia in 1870. And late in that year, 1870, that's when Virginia began its first public education system throughout the state for both Blacks and whites, although definitely in segregated schools. There were a lot of people, a lot of legislators in Virginia who didn't want it to be integrated, or they wouldn't have supported the education law. Well, in that year, 1870, there were actually 5 schools for African Americans in the county and in Harrisonburg. There was, we'll get into some of these a little bit later, but here's some of them that were built a little bit later. But those 5 in 1870, one was in Harrisonburg, one was in Bridgewater, which was also started by the Freedmen's Bureau or supported by them. And that one was actually vandalized pretty severely by people that didn't think they had any business having a school in Bridgewater at the time. And then 3 were in the eastern part of the county that became Stonewall District. That Whipple School was used from 1870 to 1882. And by the time more and more students were entering school, then they needed something larger. And that's when they went to Effenter Street and built the schoolhouse that was called Harrisonburg Colored School. Here's a picture of the first building there. And it was built 1882 to 83 to replace the Whipple School. In 1910, the Effenter Street School had an addition about the same size as the original building added onto it. So here you see a picture with the addition on it. And so that was used for many, many years. And this is where Lucy Sims, she had taught in some of those earlier schools before this building was built in Harrisonburg, but she was there the year they started, 1883, and continued until her death. Here's a picture of Lucy Sims with her 57 students in her class. Can you imagine 57 and handling that many in what wouldn't have been a greatly large classroom? Well, by 1920, there were 12 schools for Blacks in Rockingham County. And then I want to mention a little bit about eventually how many there were. And then we can see some of those pictures. Yeah, we'll look at these. There were 20 different schools for African Americans in Harrisonburg, and I have them together by the district. In Plains District, there were 2. There was one on the southern edge of Broadway, and there was the Beasley or Georgetown School, which is on the Mountain Valley Road beside Smith Creek, all sort of opposite 10th Legion along the mountain. Linville District had 2. It had the Athens School at Zimba, and it also had one in Linville that was on Crotzer Road in sort of the middle of the village. In Central District, there was a school called Peak. This is one that Lucy Sims had taught in some summers after her school year had ended at a spring school, because school didn't last but about 6 months, 5 or 6. So there's plenty of time left in the year to teach elsewhere. And this is near the Peak section of Little North Mountain. And then in Harrisonburg, we have the Whipple School, the Effenter Street School, and then Sims School would be the 3 main ones there. In Ashby District, there was a Bridgewater Colored School on Dry River Road, northwest part of town. Briary Branch had one on modern Lambertown Road near the creek, near the Briary Branch. In Mount Crawford, there was one on the north end of town along Route 11. In Pleasant Valley, there was one across from Spader's Church. It was called Pleasant Valley Colored School. And then Stonewall had the most. They had 10 schools. There was one named Brady's. It was at Port Republic. Bryant Hollow was on the east side of the Matsunutten Mountain, up Bryant Hollow near Boone's Run. I think that Boone name came from George Boone, who was a relative of Daniel Boone, who lived in that part of the county. There was one in East Elkton, the Newtown area of East Elkton. So not only did Harrisonburg have a Newtown where free slaves lived, so did Elkton. This one was northeast of Elkton on the road to Fox Mountain. And the latest school there is the one that was partially funded by Rosenwald funds, and a few years ago was added a historic marker, state marker, celebrating that school. There was an Elk Run school that was in Elkton, a Greenwood school in the Greenwood community, which is between East Point and Page County. There was one in Grottoes in the town that earlier was called Shindon, when that was the previous name for Grottoes. There was one at Island Ford along the river west of Island Ford. And there was one named Leroy. I guess they called it that, or Leroy, west of the river near Grottoes. McAllister. And here you see, that's the old McAllister Colored School in the picture, lower left. But it was replaced by another Rosenwald school, but that school got torn down when they dual lane Route 33 years ago. And then finally, Port Republic. There was one on the road to Browns Gap, east of town, that also was called Mount Vernon sometimes. So by the mid-1930s, the Evansville Street School needed replacing, and the building was condemned in 1937 as a fire hazard. And a new modern schoolhouse named for Lucy Frances Sims opened in September 1939. This would have been about a little over 5 years from the time she died. In 1954, the Supreme Court, in the case of Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, outlawed segregation of races in public schools. And 10 years later, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It contained a provision that any public school program that received federal support, federal monies, would lose that financial support unless they were fully integrated. And so that's what got things moving here 10 years after the Brown v. Board of Education case. What happened was Harrisonburg City, not wanting to lose those federal funds, told Rockingham County they would begin closing SIMS for the 1965-66 school year. And the elementary grades still operated there for another year. And the SIM school officially closed finally in 1967. One personal note, when I was a senior at Broadway High School, we got one person who lived in Linville, an African-American who came to our school and finished his high school career at Broadway High School as a senior. And unfortunately, he recently died, but that's the way Broadway High School began with integration.
Could you remind us of his name?
His name was Floyd. I think his actual full name was Andrew Floyd Temple, and he went by Floyd as our classmate. He worked for Merck for his working period.
Yeah, I had the opportunity to meet Mr. Temple, and he spoke to some of our students about what desegregation was like. And yeah, it was very kind of him to share those experiences, which, a very difficult chapter of his life, and he was quite candid about it. It was a great learning experience for students. But yeah, thank you for sharing that. We'll revisit Brown here in a moment, but I want to get Karen's take on the Sims legacy, given that she didn't see those events unfold in her lifetime, that she was one generation before, desegregation in the civil rights era. She didn't see the textbook civil rights movement unfold. Of course, her teaching in her classroom, that was as much of a civil rights struggle as what we know in the textbook. Of course, teaching students literacy skills and advancement and building community. That was the civil rights movement as much as Rosa Parks or Minnie Jean Brown or the countless others that we probably know in a more common way of national narrative. But if we could just speak to how Ms. Sims is remembered within the community. And then I'm curious, are there folks that still remember Ms. Sims or had grandparents that had Ms. Sims and so forth? What's that collective memory about her in Northeast neighborhood?
Well, Beau, I don't really know of anyone that actually remembers Miss Lucy Sims except for Miss Doris Allen. I know she had her as a teacher, and she talked about how strict she was, but how much she loved her students, and how she had her little 12-inch ruler that would tap you on the hand when you got out of control. So I really didn't have, I'm sure my ancestors were taught by her, but most of them have gone on, so I really don't know. But I know that Miss Lucy is still remembered in our community as much as she is in the state of Virginia. I think she has been honored in several ways in the community. Her name is on the African American School, which is now the Lucy F. Sims Continuing Education Center on Sims Avenue. So it was right up the street from her home. There's a mural located on the parking deck. I believe that on the parking deck wall, I believe that it's on Federal Street. The Harrisonburg Police Department recently recognized her with a plaque, which is at the school and a wreath laying during Black History Month. The Celebrating Sims traveling exhibit and expansion of the Celebrating Sims exhibit is installed in Harrisonburg High School and Rockingham County Schools. The Harrisonburg Parks and Recreation Department has recently applied for a Lucy F. Sims historical marker to be installed on the grounds of the Lucy Sims Center. Several years ago, Mayor Reed, Sandra Price, Strobel, and I spoke at the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Commission to ensure her inclusion on the Emancipation Proclamation and Freedom Monument in Richmond. And of course, the publication of Mr. Dale McAllister's extraordinary biography, Lucy Frances Sims, From Slavery to Revered Public Service. And that can be found at Rocktown History. So I think she is really honored and remembered all over. And the Northeast neighborhood is very proud.
I'm so glad you brought up the MLK Commission and the Emancipation and Freedom Monument that is soon to be unveiled, is my understanding, on Browns Island in Richmond.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Do you know if we have a date for that ceremony? I know it's probably been delayed because of COVID, or if
Right.
there's this summer to unveil that. I don't know if that's been released to the public yet.
I don't think it has. I don't know of a date yet. Mm-mm.
Jennifer McClellan, Senator Jennifer McClellan, who was the chair of that commission, spoke when we unveiled the book at the, of course, we had to reschedule that and move that to Zoom, of course, because of the circumstances we're all under now. But it had some very compelling things to say about the Sims legacy and why she was selected, and of course the case that you and Ms. Strobel and Mayor Reed made before that committee.
Mhm.
That's such a powerful story, and it's just it's encouraging to know that this story, of course, is ours as a community, and it's part of our local history. But that significance of Sims' legacy is something that has garnered, state and national attention.
Right.
It speaks highly to her legacy and what she did in her life, of course. Dale, when you were writing about her, what did you find most compelling? What was most inspirational to you, and what do you think readers will be surprised to learn?
Well, they won't be surprised to learn, because Karen kind of gave them a hint that she was a very stern disciplinarian, and so many people that JMU interviewed over the last few decades who had been students of Lucy Sims, almost all of them talked about her stern discipline and her ready with the ruler to smack them on the hand or whatever to put them in order. Well, she was such a good disciplinarian that other teachers in the school, including probably her half brother, E.G. Wilson, who was in the room beside her, would send them to Lucy Sims' classroom, and she'd speak to them a little bit in the hall and send them back to class, and apparently it would straighten them out. Everybody respected her so much, but she loved her students. She wanted the best for them. She cared about their education, but she also cared about how they looked. For instance, if there was going to be Superintendent Keister was going to come visit the classroom, she had a brush and comb in her desk drawer that she would get out and fix the hair of the students so they looked their best for the visitors. And she cared about that. She cared about her own dress and was a smart dresser. But she was also not content with just her good education that she received at Hampton Institute. And in fact, we kind of hinted at earlier that many of those teachers were well qualified. Well, there was a point where 13 teachers in Rockingham County and Harrisonburg City had all been through Hampton Institute, and so they all had good teacher certificates that were much better than the certificates that a young female here in the county would have to be sent off to some one-room school somewhere and sink or swim based upon could she handle it or could she not. And so they were very well prepared, and the education was really first rate. She also went to these summer sessions at Hampton to increase her knowledge and become a better teacher. And she was very active in the local and state organizations for African American teachers. And she often, well, she was even an officer in the state association for a while, but in most of the meetings, when you see them reported in the local Harrisonburg paper, she was one who spoke at the meeting and often gave an instructional program about something to help you be a better teacher of reading or a better teacher of math and so forth. So she was a well-informed woman who shared her knowledge with her fellow teachers.
Yeah, she certainly embodied the sentiment of educators of being lifelong learners. She was taking courses and professional development into her 50s and 60s, which, teaching into your 50s and 60s, I can't imagine, continually improving your craft through professional development at that stage in your career. That is quite a testament. To Karen, how did the Sims School thrive in spite, shifting now from Miss Sims' life to the school, of course, that is her namesake and legacy. It existed in its entirety during the Jim Crow era, and unfortunately closed its doors, I think somewhat tragically as a result of desegregation. But how did the Sims School thrive in spite of Jim Crow inequality? And while celebrating the great positives of Black schools, what should Americans also know about the impact that segregation had on Black education?
Well, I think that one of the main reasons Sims School thrived despite the inequality of the Jim Crow segregation is because African Americans understood the need for unity as well as education. In order for them to achieve the beloved community that we were working for locally, the impact of segregation on Black education meant the need for African American teachers to work hard, to give their students a sense of pride in themselves. And this is what all the educators we have talked about here tonight did very well. This could be a difficult question to discuss because desegregation brought about more resources, more opportunities for Black students to go into the larger Harrisonburg school system, but it also brought with it losing dozens of African American educators who were not hired into the public city school system as Black teachers for mostly white students due to racial discrimination. So even as we had a generation of students make history with integration, we also had our community lose the intellectual leaders and educators that had guided us for a century, up until the point that this was just one of the unintended consequences of closing Sims School. Our teachers, there were a lot of great students that came out of Sims School: doctors, nurses, lawyers, educators, engineers. So the education at Sims was not substandard. But we did lose, I think we lost a lot of the pride and we lost the sense of community was one of the consequences, was just one or two of the consequences that I can think of.
As a history educator, we have to be very careful about, and I think in the past we framed Brown versus Board as this great step forward as a society, which it was in some ways, but there were also many unintended consequences and perhaps intended consequences in other contexts that were a great price to pay in order to move into a phase of desegregation. So that story, I think, oftentimes is not, or maybe has not been taught with the nuance that it demands to be able to tell that full story of the challenges of desegregation. And one thing that I've learned of in the local community and those that have been willing to share those stories, because they're quite personal. Mr. Temple comes to mind, along with others that were willing to share those stories, that while perhaps it wasn't as contentious and violent as it was in other places throughout the South, that does not mean that this was a good story for many of the people who were asked to be that first generation of desegregation.
No, it wasn't.
That's a story that I think our students need to know.
Mm-hmm.
The civil rights era has always been taught, as it should be, as this celebration. But in teaching about African-American history, we, of course, need to be honest with ourselves. And we're at this inflection point as a country where we're recognizing, at least the larger society in the Black community, this is a history that's, of course, been taught for generations and has been a part of history and culture. I think the larger society start to recognize what it hasn't taught, and it's giving context to what they have taught. And I just, as a history educator, I'm excited about what the future holds and this inflection moment that we find ourselves in. I hope that we do the right thing moving forward. This evening, this has been great conversation. I wish we had more time to engage in these. This is in the history teacher world is what we call hard history. And that doesn't mean it's necessarily negative, but it's a hard history that does require great nuance and different approaches than perhaps it's been given in our standards, in our curriculum in the past, and in our practices. So as a history teacher, I'm excited about the direction that we're going. So let me ask you that to you both. How has the study of Black history, African-American history, how has that evolved during your lifetimes, and what still needs to be done?
Well, I'll go ahead and start first because I want to mention some people. Karen mentioned one of those, and I'll get to that in a moment. But I hope that my work on the Sims biography certainly makes the Wilson and the Sims families better known, and also more about the history of the schools for African Americans in Harrisonburg following the Civil War, because the book goes into that a good bit too. But I'm really pleased about that there's more interest now in the Northeast neighborhood in the African American experience than when I began working on some of the things about Lucy Sims. And it's gratifying to witness the new preservation efforts that Karen is a part of and others in the community are engaged in as well. So some of the people, well, I mentioned Beau Harper, maybe. Beau was the son of Doris Harper Allen. Karen mentioned her. Unfortunately, Doris passed away today. She was a 1945 graduate of Sims School and an early promoter of Newtown history, and also history of Lucy Sims. And as Karen said, she's the one person that I talked to who had actually had Lucy Sims for a teacher. Also, Lois Rouser, I think, had Lucy her last year. Lois is in adult care facility in Harrisonburg now, but her mind is as clear as can be. And she remembered Lucy too, but had her when she was very young, when Lois was. Beau was a son of Doris, and he was in the elementary grades at Sims, but then he went to Thomas Harrison when the schools were integrated. Doris herself has written books about growing up in Newtown, one that's been out for a few years, and another one that I think she's completed, but we're not sure whether it's been published or not, but it's in process. And then finally, Ruth Tolliver. she's the granddaughter of George A. Newman. Maybe Susan could pull up that faculty picture from the Sims School faculty, the Esther School faculty. There. The man in the suit coat in the middle is W.N.P. Harris, and he was more of a classical educator, while George Newman was he believed in teaching skills as well as teaching education, learning, general learning. Well, so this George Newman, another principal there, was grandfather of Ruth Tolliver. She wrote a book about the Kelly Street Church and another about the early history of Newtown and the Dallard, Newman, Harper, and Tolliver families. So there have been things written about the different families there. In this picture, you could see Lucy Sims was the third woman from the left. And in her sort of more advanced years, with some graduates in the school that year and some other teachers.
Well, I would say that, there's so much attention given to Black history today, and it has much improved in the past decades. I would like to name a few sources where those that are watching can learn more about our Black history. The Campus History Committee at JMU and the JMU AAAD Center. And also the new report called Reclaiming, Renaming, Repairing, which was prepared by the Campus History Committee at JMU. This report will serve as a very valuable resource related to regional Black history for a very long time to come. People can view and download the report right now at our Facebook page, Northeast Neighborhood Association of Harrisonburg, Virginia. And I encourage people to read it because it helps to map out a lot of the work that still needs to be done and includes great information about the African-American experience in city schools after integration. So I think those are some really good resources.
Excellent. I'll segue into some of the events that were mentioned earlier. The Governor's Commission on African American History Education concluded its report this past summer, and that has led to a number of, there's legislation now about cultural competency requirements for schools to meet, teacher training in that regard. There's a new African American elective course now that's available that we are advertising to students as we speak. That'll be offered in the fall. Sounds like we have a lot of popularity and we'll have a number of sections of the course. So that's good to hear. That's a new course that will focus entirely on the African American experience as an elective course that students would take in grades 9 through 12. And it's just exciting work, but certainly work that we don't pat ourselves on the back and say we're doing this work. It's what we're leaning into, and much work, of course, still needs to be done. Mm-hmm. We have some questions from the crowd. I know that we are up to about the 8 o'clock hour, so I'm probably going to defer to some questions now. If you'd like to go ahead and put those in the chat. I see that we do have some already, so let me go ahead and defer to those. And if there are any more, go ahead and enter those at this time. We may have to be a little bit selective. Oh, go ahead, Susan, I'm sorry.
Oh, but that's okay, Beau. I was going to say, actually, they should put them in the Q&A, which is where they have been, and I've put them in the chat for you all. So yeah, there are about 4 questions there. So you can start at the top and see if, I don't think there's any duplicates, so I tried to weed those out.
Okay, so our first question is, did the African American children that were educated in segregated schools stay in the local community, or did they migrate out? Did that change over time?
Karen, I think you probably know that better than I do.
I can, something has happened to my screen. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Can you hear us? Oh, goodness. Looks like we lost Karen. Well, there she is. Can you hear us, Karen? I think you're muted.
There.
What was the question?
So the question was about children in segregated schools. So I guess that would have been many generations, of course. The question was, did they stay in the local community or did they migrate out? Did that change over time?
Most of the children from the Northeast community migrated out. They left the city that went to integrated schools. A lot of them left here and went north mostly.
Would that have been around the movement north and the Great Migration in those years in the early 20th century?
Yeah, in the early years. But if you mean, well, even in the later years, a lot of it seemed like there was not much here for African Americans, even though it was integration. We were still. It was still desegregation, really. We were still discriminated against a lot. So I think a lot of people left Harrisonburg.
Interesting. That chapter, that story, we've looked at nationally, of course, but that local lens in the post Great Migration era, I think. You have a chapter of that story that would kind of fall in within that nuance with Brown that we need to explore at a deeper level to really get a deeper understanding of, for that fuller history. Another question asks, do you believe, or this is interesting, what do you believe Lucy Sims would be championing today beyond education? If she lived in the world that we are witnessing, what would she be championing today beyond just education?
Well, women's rights for sure. The ERA.
Yes, just one example. The year that women received the right to vote, she wasted no time getting down to the courthouse and registering to vote. So she would have been right there in the modern things that were going on in society.
Yeah, I believe so.
This next question is really kind of rooted in the history of the book, Dale, when you were looking at college education at the time. How accessible was that? How unique is Miss Sims' story in terms of historical context, given the fact that she was able to go to Hampton Institute, an entirely relatively new, higher level of education that was available to African Americans at that time? How unique was that?
Well, I'm sure it was rather rare. And in her case, the Gray family that were her slave masters after emancipation, they always had a feeling of wanting to help their former slaves. And we're pretty sure that they helped her gain admission into Hampton Institute. And we know that they tried to get her half-brother Eugene Wilson into Hampton Institute and so forth. But her education at Hampton lasted 3 years, 1874 to 77. And when she finished those 3 years, then everybody had to work that was on campus that helped pay for your tuition and allowed you to be there. Also, her older brother, John Sims, helped some with her finances. So the financial matter would have been something that was important that a lot of people wouldn't have had the ability to do. But when she finished, she didn't have a degree because Hampton couldn't confer bachelor's degrees until the 1920s. So what she got was a teacher certificate, but it was the best that was available at the time in the state of Virginia.
We have one final, we're right at the 8 o'clock hour, and we have one final question. Right, you've spoken about all the different schools in Rockingham County. Was there a unified oversight of those schools, or did each school exist independently of the others? How was the curriculum decided upon, and how were they funded? Was tax money available to them, or were they privately funded by the community or parents of students?
Well, it's almost all of the above, because until 1916, Rockingham County ran their schools by the magisterial district they were in. And so each district had their own school board that chose the books for their schools and tried to hire the teachers and so forth. It wasn't until after 1916 that all of that came under the umbrella of Rockingham County schools. And at that point, Harrisonburg also broke away from the county and became their own independent school division. But the county would recommend books to be used, and you had a choice of what to pick from to use in your classrooms. Students did have to have a little bit of money. By the way, Virginia would only pay for the elementary grades. And so if you wanted high school education, for many, many years, you ended up having to pay some tuition to attend high school classes. The state would help with the elementary students. And that's basically the way it worked. It was pretty much up to the teacher, and even each school had their own school board that was responsible for the building upkeep and things like that. So they also had a hand in deciding what was taught, what could be used.
Well, thank you for those questions, and thank you to you both for your perspective and all this knowledge and learning that we've had this evening. Is there anything that you would like to leave us with? Any other comments that you would like to make? I want to thank you both for the contributions that have led to this book, and to you both of just as community leaders and what you've done for this community and how you're sharing it with us this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Beau.
Okay, and so I want to thank everybody for attending this evening, and just a reminder that this has been recorded, so it will be on the MRL YouTube channel. And we look forward to seeing everybody next week. So have a good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you all. Okay.